In this video, we will discuss how to set up a 2-node cluster for file services. So the first thing you need to do is make sure you have a domain controller, you have your DNS server set up. Let me just do some cleanup here because we did some testing earlier. So we have a domain controller and we have node 1, node 2. That's what I have. These are VMs. So if you are using iSCSI server, and you have shared storage, you could do it this way. The way I'm going to show you here is a way of connecting using iSCSI. So just give you a little drawing here. So let me back off some of these lines to explain it better. So the intention here is you're trying to make a 2-node cluster through VMs. So we have our iSCSI hosts running VMs. Typically you would set up your storage like this. The host would go to the storage. Your VMs would run. And from a VMware perspective, if this node were to go down, then the VMs would fail over to here. And the VMs would run. The reason why that works is because the storage is there. So the VMs are actually stored here, but when they fail here, you can actually get them started and move over here. And that's called VMware clustered fault tolerance, and HA and DRS. All those functions will do that. They'll move the VMs over. So the intention of this video is not so much to go into how VMware works, but just how we can get a cluster going. So this is called a data store, right? So we have a data store. This will be a data store that's in your VMware environment. That's a shared storage that you've got from your storage here that you presented along to the both hosts. Now you have a storage area to put your VMs on. That's perfect. In iSCSI, if you want to have a cluster now, you need to have a disk that's kind of independent or dedicated. What I usually do from a storage perspective is I share over fiber channel. I present storage as raw LUNs. And then what I do is I connect the raw LUNs, the raw disks, to the VM itself. So let's say there's 3 disks I want to bring on. And then once I create those disks, I go to the other VM and I point to where they're stored for this one, which would, let me get that back here. So what I would do is then point this server to the same exact storage. That's how you do it through fiber channel. I'm going to show you in this video how we do it through iSCSI, because iSCSI is another type of storage. So we're going to use this domain controller. I have a second disk that I created. Second disk is 60 disks, 60 gigabytes, and this is going to be my storage for the cluster. So I'm going to open up my file manager, disk manager, just to show you. So there's iSCSI disk I have created. And then what we're going to do, just going to minimize all this for you. So then what we're going to do is we're going to open up the iSCSI tool. So make sure you install it. And we're going to go to targets, right? Or volumes here. Now you can use this way. The better way to do it is through your server manager. Let me just go back here. So open up your server manager. When you open up server manager, go to file and storage services. Then you go to iSCSI. And then what you can do is you can create a new target. So you say new disk, right? Or in this case, right? New virtual disk. I have a disk here I've created. Now watch my other videos. I did have another video about iSCSI, how to set it up. So we have a disk here, and there's the disk I want to use. So we could do it that way. So once I have the disk chosen, that's the disk I want to use for clustering. And then I want to create a target. So when I create a target, I created this target, FS cluster. Right? I called it FS cluster. I included the 2 nodes that I want to share it with. And then I didn't put any security on it, and then the connections. So I could back this out to show you exactly how I did it. So what I need to do is go to these hosts, and you'll see there's no disk there, right? So what we want to do is go to the domain controller again. So I'm going to delete my target and start a brand new one. And I will remove this as well. So I will start fresh. So you go to iSCSI, you want to create a virtual disk. The server has its disk attached, which is the E drive. That's where I want this iSCSI target. And I'm going to call this FS cluster, file server cluster, and next. And I'm going to use 20 gigabytes of a disk. And then I'm going to start a new target. And this target is going to be FS cluster 00. And now I want to add servers to be able to connect to it. So I already have node 1 and node 2, but you can add them. Once you add those targets, you're then telling it to go to node 1 and node 2. So let's go to node 1 now. So I have node 1 and node 2 as targets that can connect to this disk I'm making. The next part is some type of security. Now, I'm not using any security because it's just within my lab, but in a real world situation, you should enable chat, make a user and password, and reverse chat if you want more security. What that does is just prevents anybody from searching for iSCSI targets and connecting to them and getting into your disks. So if you put a chat method, you know the login and password to that for the host to connect to. I'm not using that right now. So we just go through, we created a disk, we're connecting to that disk we just had, and I'm creating a target. Now you will see we have a target here, and here it is. Nobody's connected to it right now. Let's go to the hosts. So in order to have this server connect to the disk we want to do, we want to pull up Disk Manager. And you notice there's no disk, right? We want to make sure that we don't have any disks between those 2 hosts. And there you go. So we don't have that disk. So minimize that for now. Same with this, minimize it. Now what you need to do is you need to go to the host that you want to connect to. So node 1, we want to pull up the iSCSI initiator, and I'll disconnect this one. Right. Refresh. So the first thing you do here is you say no, you say DC1, which is the server I want to connect to. There it is. It's now connected. And now let's go here. You see a disk. Let's go to node 2 and do the same thing. Pull up the iSCSI tool. So we see no disk there. Let's open the iSCSI tool, or the iSCSI initiator, sorry. And again, we just refresh because we already added before I was doing some testing. So let's type DC1 as a server we want to connect to. It's going to connect it, and we have the disk. So now we have the disk shared from this domain controller. So no, they both have the same volume shared. What we need to do now is enable this disk. Online, initialize, GPT, and we want to go same thing, online. And now it's mentioned about the disk is kind of connected to another server, right? So online, there you go. So let's go here. Let's format this disk. And just call it shared volume. So shared volume E. Let's go here. Let's refresh. Rescan. Now it will act a little weird because you have it connected here and here. You can't really connect it that way because you would need to install clustering if this worked. So let's focus on the node 1. The node 1 has the drive. It is popping up in Windows. You have an E drive. There you go. And we're just going to put a folder on it called new folder. So done. Let's get rid of this. Now let's open up our cluster tools. Now before we do that, we need to make sure it's installed. So you open up Server Manager. You install your Failover Cluster. This is node 1. You just need Failover Clustering Services. Let's go back and make sure you have File Services. Once that's that way, then you say next. Right, we already have that installed, so you would go next, installed, but I'm already installed. So we're going to open the the Failover Cluster. Click two clicks in there. So Administrative Tools, Failover Cluster Manager. Now I want to make sure we don't have any junk laying around in our AD. So let's open up our AD tools on our domain controller. Okay. Now I'm just going to refresh. Now these ones are all old records from junk, so I'm going to delete these. There you go. So we have 2 nodes and our domain controller. Perfect. Let's go to node 1. Let's create a cluster. Next. Now, server name, we want to find out. Let's add node 1 because that's what server we have. And next. Now we want to name the cluster. So let's call it cluster. You should come up with more of a better naming scheme. So like shared disk cluster. So I'm going to go cluster, just call it a cluster. And we need to give it an IP address. So let's find out what address we have free. So let's go 178. 178. Let's click next. So this is going to create a computer record. If we flip over to our domain controller, we will see a computer record being created. There you go, called cluster. Now what we also have to do is on this server, we have to make sure cluster is in the DNS. And there you go. So cluster was created. So that means now when we ping cluster, that should respond. And it does. Perfect. So let's go back to node 1. So we've created our cluster. Perfect. Let's add another node now. So we'll add node 2. Browse node 2. And now we have 2 nodes. Now we have a 2-node failover cluster. One can shut down, the other one will take over. But we don't have anything at all on this cluster. Now it found a disk, found E, found that that 20 gigabyte disk, because when we created a cluster, generally it will go looking for disks. So it has that volume. Let's look and see who has that volume right now. So we have shared volume right here. Let's go to E, number 2. Now, if we refresh the disks, see how it's reserved. You want to bring it online. Now this is because it's sitting on it is a cluster and it knows it's used by the other host. So we can ignore that for now. Let's bring up the failover cluster. And let's bring up Windows Explorer. So Windows Explorer shows no E drive. Let's go back to node 1. We can confirm we have an E drive. Let's go back into the failover cluster. And let's change this one over to the other host. So we're going to go nodes, and I'm going to pause node 1 and drain the roles. Let's go to disks, and it should be on node 2. So now on node 1, where I am now, the E drive is missing. Node 2, the E drive exists. If you go to disk storage now, you see it's there. And it will happen both nodes. So now we have a shared disk between the two. Now what we want to do is something else. We're sharing what? We're sharing a disk. Node 2 has the disk. So let's open up our cluster again. So we have a disk. It is being shared. I can move it over. I can simulate failure. Right? It keeps on 2. Let's go to node because that's paused. Let's resume and don't fail back. Now let's go to disk and let's say simulate failure. See, so now it gets stuck. These are things you want to test. Let's refresh. Let's go to nodes and let's tell node 1 to resume, right? Or now it's already resumed. So let's pause node 2 and see if the disk fails over now. There you go. So node 2 is paused. Let's resume it now and let's not fail it back. So we want to keep that disk on 1. Now on 1 is this one. So we know we have the E drive. Now what we want to do is we want to create a file share. Because right now we have the cluster. So if we do this, it's named cluster. We have a cluster. If we go cluster $, it's not going to know what that is because we need to create a share. So what we need to do now, we need to check out what are our errors, right? This is because we were messing around. So let's clear these out so we don't have any errors. And now we have to add a role. So now what we want to do is create a role called a file server role. We want to leave it for general use. Let's call this file server. Let's go CL file server. And we need to give this an address now. So let's give it 176. Okay. We want to choose the disk we want to use. .176 is there. Now what we have to do, now it's running. We have to go to the domain controller now and confirm that DNS updated itself with that new record. And it did. So now we know DNS recognizes CL file server at that IP address. Let's go back to node 1. Now we have CL file server. Now what we want to do is actually create a file share. So right click on it. It's going to go out. It's going to make sure. So now what kind of file share? Let's make just a quick SMB share, right? That's the disk we want to use. The share name. And we want to call it cluster share. So right here, right? And that will be the name of how to get to it. So let's copy that. Let's go next. Enable continuously available. Leave that. Permissions. So if you want to add anybody special, you can. I'm just using administrator right now. Let's create this file share. And so now when we go down to shares, we see a file share. So let's try and get there from this node. We're going to go here and go paste. And there it is. Now let's make a file or a folder and put some files there. Okay, so there's the documents, and we have folders and we have everything there. Now let's go to node 2 and let's see if we can find that from node 2. So we want to go to CL file share and then cluster. What was the name of it? Cluster share. Now you want to make a friendlier name, right? CL file, I did it wrong. Cluster share, shares, CL file server. That's why it's important to know what you call them. CL file server. And now you see we're actually on that share. So we know it's sitting on node 1. It's live on node 1. Now we go there, we see these, right? New folder, we see shares, and there you go. So we see that data. Now let's go to the nodes and let's pause number 1 and drain the roles. So that's basically we're forcing it to fail over. Now we should see the disk go to 2. We should see the roles go to 2. When we go to 2 now, we should see that there's an E drive there. And there we go. Now let's go back here and try to get to that file share again. And it's there. And if we want to say, let's add more folders to it. Right? So we can now access the file share still from the cluster, even though node 1 doesn't own it. It's over on node 2 right now. And we go to node 2 and we can see all the folders we just created. If I do like this, node 2, if I go to node 1, I see the files there. So that's how you do a file share between 2 nodes. So let's say right now it is shared on 2, right? So let's have something happen to 2. So the power was lost. We lost our cluster. Let's look at here now. So we go to our cluster. We go to nodes, right? Now, you shouldn't ever leave. See, now I just did something totally wrong. Let's make sure the cluster comes back up first. So let's refresh. Something I always seem to do. Make that little mistake about leaving the cluster down when I'm testing. So we want to resume, but because we tore the cluster down suddenly, so there we go, we're back. So both nodes are available. Node 1 owns it. Node 1 owns it, right? The share is going to be there. So now what we want to do is we want to simulate a catastrophic failure. So node 1 owns it right now, right? Fresh. We got the roll on node 1. We got the disk on node 1. Let's go to node 2, right? I'm sorry, node 1, and let's abruptly turn it off. Now, in order to see the cluster, we need to go on node 2. We want to make sure we can get there. So we're logging on node 2. Now, without even touching it, we can go to the domain controller here, and we can do that file share. There's our share. There's our files. So we know it's available. I'm on the different box. I'm able to get there. It's still available. If I go here and type and save it, I just wrote to the file. I go to node 2, pull up the file cluster, or sorry, the failover cluster. It's going to tell me node 1's failed. Right? Node 1's down. Node 2 is up. Now let's bring 1 back online, right? Power is now restored. Let's look at the cluster. Once Windows actually boots up correctly, all the services start, you will see this node down turn into node up. Let's watch it. And again, there you go. It's booted up, joining up. Now it's still a node 2 because the cluster has been assigned node 2. And if we want to abruptly fail this over, we can do that. Now the key to it is keep the nodes alive, right? So let's shut this down, right? We've already confirmed node 2 is the one that's live, right? Let's go on here, right? Let's go here actually, refresh. Make sure you get to the share. I clicked it 3 times is why it's going out and reading that. So while we're doing that, let's log in here just to make sure we're good. Let's go back to that domain controller. It's trying to get to that share. We could stop this connection. And let's do this again. So what'll happen now is you'll still be able to get to the share because it's still there. The disk hasn't failed over yet because we did this abrupt failure. We need our cluster to come up. That's why you can't get to the share. So the whole idea here is you don't want to be just powering off your machines. The idea is if it becomes lost, it will then pick it up and have failover. And it's showing services didn't start. This is why you don't just abruptly turn things off. So let's go here. So we have a cluster. Refresh. Go to services. Okay, so we got our cluster. Node 1 is the role. We have 2 nodes. They're both up. And we have our storage. Let's go back to DC1. We see the file here. We're going to go in and edit this and put TTTTT, save. And now we're going to do it right. So let's suspend this node, right? So we want to just make it look like a failover. So let's pull the network cable. And in a VM, pulling a network cable, you just basically shut off the NIC. So without doing it in Windows, let's go to the VM. Go to network and turn off network. Let's go to node 2, see what's going on. Let's see if the cluster is recognized it failed over. There you go. It was failing over as it did it. So fail over there. We go back here. We can open up the document. We see TTT there. 333, save. And there you go. So this was no planning setting up this cluster. This was just something to set up iSCSI to create a cluster between two nodes using a shared disk. We pulled the network adapter to present a failure type that the hardware went down or the hardware went missing. When it comes back, see how it says down, give it a couple seconds for it to broadcast itself on the network again. It will then present itself as up. Now, what I've seen sometimes is when you have a node go down like that, you may need to actually go to the server itself and just confirm, right? So let's go to node 2. And we want to just make sure it does come up. So what you might have to do is go to services. When you pull up services, you just have to make sure the clustering service is running. So you go cluster service, make sure it's running. So if you do have a failover problem, and that's why I was just abruptly ripping things apart here. See how they're both up now. It takes a couple minutes for the server to see the other server. So when you have a failover cluster, it depends on your network speed and your network equipment that you have and how you configured everything. Again, I just set up a base setup, 2 servers on the network with a domain controller, and I created a cluster. I created iSCSI disks to share the disks between each other, and that's how you can do an ESX2. You can do iSCSI to hardware, so from physical storage, as I drew here. So from your physical storage, if it is iSCSI, you can present disks as iSCSI, and then to the VMs, you connect to iSCSI, both of them, and then you do your failover that way. That's the easiest way of doing it. Fiber channel is a little more involved, it works better when you use iSCSI and fiber channel rather than using a data store. I have used data stores in VMware. I've had some issues too. So the recommended way is to use iSCSI from your storage or fiber channel, raw LUNs. So that's how I've done clustering before. That's the way you can do it on ESXi. I'm doing it from VMware Workstation on my Windows 11 machine here. And that's how you do it. Like I said, you have to make sure every entry you put in the cluster. So let's go back through here. Anything you do in a cluster, such as roles, you set up this, and it has the shares, right? As soon as you set up the role and it does an IP address and a name, make sure the DNS picks it up. If it doesn't put it in DNS, you're going to have errors like can't resolve name, things like that. Same thing when you first create the cluster. Make sure that record from AD, that little cluster record, gets created. Because if it doesn't, it's going to have a problem. See right here? If it doesn't create that cluster record as a computer account, then it's not going to be able to reach out to that cluster being the node that's in between them, right? Because you can't call node 1 and node 2 because if one of them go down, you can't get there. So the cluster, or whatever you want to call it, will be the one that connects between the two, because this is more like the load balancer. So you're going to point here and it knows those two are there. it'll go to either one, the active or passive one. Most times it'll be the active one, and when you fail over, it'll go to passive. Now you could do an active as well, but this video was just to make a very simple file share cluster. As you see here, we created a role, a file server role. We created a share. It has a default $, but we created a share to use, and everybody can get to that share. That's how you do it. And again, the whole process behind making sure the nodes are up is what you need to do. They're both up, but which one is active? You just look here. Node owner, the disk, should always be the same one. So that's how you do a file share cluster using Windows Failover Cluster Manager. So Failover Cluster Manager will create the cluster. The cluster connects the 2 units together, and then it has an owner of the task you're trying to do. So in this case here, I created a file server with a file share. DNS was created. The DNS record was created. It has all the naming for it. Everything was done. And we could have the network. Now, we're not usually just going to go rip the cable out to test it, but that's how we tested it, right? We could power it off, but we saw when we did that, we didn't confirm the cluster services were running. And that's something you need to make sure you do. You need to make sure you bring up services. And that's how you confirm your cluster's up. Look for your cluster service, make sure it's running. On the node that's not live, it may not be running because services. So the cluster service is definitely running. So that's something you want to make sure that both your clusters have a running service, and then there will be an active and passive node. So in this case here, we see the service running. We see the disks belong to node 1. Node 1, and how we could prove that is by pulling up File Explorer, and we should see that disk. You notice how the disk isn't there. Should we refresh the screen? Node 2. It says node 2 is the owner. So let's refresh here. Let's go back to node 1. See how it's pending? Probably because the screen is, yeah, there it is. It was just because the screen wasn't upgraded. You gotta love it when your system's not running too fast. I have 100 other things running in the background. But yes, so node 1 is showing node 2 is the owner. Node 2 is showing node 2 is the owner. And we can confirm that again by where the E drive is, that shared volume. So that's how you do it. Hope you enjoyed watching. Please like, subscribe, and suggest more videos. I will make a more polished video of this. This was just something to rush to get it up for someone who was requesting it. So thanks for watching.